Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Before he was murdered in October 2018, Saudi journalist Jamal Kashoggi created an organization to promote democracy and human rights in the Middle East. It was called Democracy for the Arab World Now, or very simply, Dawn. 2 years to the month after his killing, the non-profit has relaunched in Washington, D.C. with substantial financial and political backing. Today, we're very fortunate to have with us Jamal's successor, the executive director of the group, Leah Whitson. Hello, Sarah. Thank you for joining. Before I start, I think there are many people here who won't realize that Dawn's creation was actually central to Jamal's death. Can you just outline very briefly what you suggest in the lawsuit that you have launched against the Saudi officials involved in his death?
Sure. So what we know from the facts is that the Saudi Arabian government targeted Jamal Khashoggi because of his outspoken criticism of the monarchy, of the kingdom, and its abuses from Washington, of course, on the pages of the Washington Post, but also this new organization he had founded, Dawn. We know that this is something that they were very concerned about because they went to the trouble to hack the telephone of Omar Abdulaziz, who was someone he was talking to about setting up the organization. And that was of great concern to them because they very much, number one, don't like criticism and particularly don't like criticism coming from the center of the world's power, Washington, D.C., with which they wanted to maintain very close relations. And so that is why they targeted him. That is why they lured him to Istanbul on false pretenses and murdered him.
Yeah. There are many organizations that promote human rights and look at the issue of democracy in the Middle East. But can you say how you're doing things differently? And you do have a different approach.
We do have a different approach. I guess I would start by saying that we are really a hybrid organization. We are not just a human rights organization, although human rights investigations is part of what we do. We are also a publishing platform, we are a think tank, and we're an advocacy organization. So we're really trying to do a lot. The need is great. With respect to the human rights research that we are undertaking, I think it has two unique pieces. And they are very much a reflection of the fact that we don't want to duplicate the work of other excellent organizations, and we do want to fill the gap on what they're not doing. In terms of offering a value added of our research, the focus is on particular cases of prosecution, unjust prosecution, in the countries that we're targeting, which are Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, and I can explain why later. The goal is to provide encyclopedic documentation of what's happened in these cases of prosecution, where the facts really do speak for themselves in terms of the miscarriages of justice, but also offer a vital resource to other journalists, other organizations, policymakers to always know what's happened in a case and what's happening. I think in terms of the human rights research, the other aspect that's unique is that we want to focus on the perpetrators as much as we do on the victims. We want to hold the perpetrators accountable. We want to stigmatize them. We want to expose them as the pariahs that they are, with as much energy and force as we do trying to get sympathy for the victims.
Okay, well, we're going to have a look at all of that in just a second, because I think this is interesting. I mean, just to be upfront about this, I used to work very briefly at Human Rights Watch, and Sarah was actually my boss for a while. So I'm familiar with the human rights work she's done and the work in the Middle East. We've got a video, which I think is a good sort of introduction to Dawn's work. So we're just going to bring that up. We might not play all of it. I think we might play a minute and a half of it. So Isabel's just going to bring that up now.
Over the past decade, tens of millions of people in the Middle East and North Africa have risen up against corrupt and autocratic regimes, demanding freedom, rights, and democratic reforms. But the ruling elites, threatened with the loss of their unchecked powers, have reacted with the repressive tools they have honed over decades. Many leaders of these uprisings have become casualties, jailed, or exiled. But the demands for democracy and human rights persist, deepen, and expand. As a leading Saudi journalist, Jamal Kashoggi championed the quest for democracy and freedom. For this, he was forced to flee his country. In early 2018, Kashoggi and colleagues who share his values established DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now, an organization devoted to championing rights and democracy in the region, not for tomorrow, but for today. Democracy now. In October 2018, the Saudi government murdered Jamal, fearful of the influence his calls for freedom would have. DAWN honors the legacy of Jamal Kashoggi by continuing his work, demanding human rights in the Arab world and justice for the victims of the region's tyrants. We investigate and document abusive arrests, trials, and detentions, providing a resource for comprehensive information on some of the most significant prosecutions. Unmask the servile bureaucrats who carry out and enable the abuse and oppression of their fellow citizens. Expose the complicity of foreign governments and businesses in enabling the abuses of oppressive regimes. We measure the performance of the international community in supporting or undermining democracy and rights in the region. We call it the Kashoggi Index. We advocate for accountability, reform, and the rule of law in the region and abroad, and build a platform for democracy exiles from the region and experts to share their analysis of the Middle East and North Africa, engage in dialogue and a debate to better understand the complex challenges of the region, and propose a vision for a rights-respecting future. DAWN, Democracy for the Arab World Now. Join us at dawnmina.org.
So, Sarah, in a moment, we're going to look at the website and some of those cases that you look at and study, of journalists who've been in prison, that kind of thing. But perhaps we can start with Jamal's own case and also the importance of you putting pressure on the US government, because that's really key to what you do, isn't it?
It is a big part of what we do. And one of the key aspects of Jamal's case that we're focused on right now is our actual lawsuit against Mohammed bin Salman and his co-conspirators in a federal district court in Washington, D.C. for the murder of our founder, as well as for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée, Khadija Cengiz. She's a co-plaintiff with us in the lawsuit. One of the things that is also very important to us right now is seeking the declassification and release of the report of the Department of National Intelligence, which gathered the evidence that led to their conclusion that Mohammed bin Salman himself ordered the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. The Congress demanded that the State Department release this report, that the Trump administration release this report. After over 6 months of delay and obfuscation and refusal, they finally released it to Congress, but kept it classified. And so now there is a lawsuit pending against the Department of National Intelligence and the State Department to force disclosure of that report. We are going to join in that lawsuit as well. But what we're hoping for is that a Biden administration will come in and with the stroke of a pen, declassify this report.
And what's your, the consequence of that? I mean, if what are you hoping would be the result of the case? What could happen to those who you are pursuing?
Well, certainly with or without the release of that report, but certainly helped by the release of that report, it strongly strengthens our case of the evidence and information that ties the MBS to this crime. And should Mohammed bin Salman appear in the United States, or should he fail to appear, but his assets remain in the United States, that would provide important opportunity for remedy for our organization and for Khadija in our civil case against MBS. But obviously the significance of this is far greater, and it is affirming the fundamental principle of accountability. Accountability for the heinous abuse that shocked the entire world of luring, kidnapping, capturing, and cutting up the body of another human being merely because you didn't like their criticism of what they had to say. You know, gruesome murders happen every day, but for one of the most senior officials of a government to orchestrate this kind of a barbaric crime with the resources of the state, with the resources of government, across borders, I think elevated the wrongness, the criminality to a different level. And so holding MBS accountable is not only important in justice in Jamal's case, but as an important deterrent to others who may want to copy Saudi Arabia's example should they get away with it.
Right, okay. And this comes back again to the point about many human rights organizations would document cases of abuse. They would be published and given to journalists. And by and large, you hope that that would bring some kind of pressure on the governments concerned. But your sort of main issue is that you're based in Washington and that you're going to use much political leverage as possible to put pressure on these governments and also through the courts.
Yes, I mean, very much so, as well as legal pressure, as well as public pressure. You know, there are a variety of tools in our arsenal in this struggle, and other human rights organizations do some of the things that we do. They do advocate with government officials and so forth. Certainly, an incoming Biden administration is going to dramatically expand the opportunities for that.
I think you've got a few alarms on your computer jumping in. Let's get to the nitty-gritty. I mean, we've got some pages from the website, and I think these are really useful. And I would advocate that people have a look at the website. You are particularly focused on countries where the US has significant influence. So Saudi Arabia is an obvious one. The United Arab Emirates is another one, and Egypt is another one. So if you go to on the homepage, they've got case studies. And so you can see Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and UAE there. And I think we're going to take a particular case. If we go up to the cases section, not the judge, further to the right, if we take the cases section, we're going to take an example. So you can focus on many of these are journalists or opposition figures who've been arrested and have been kept in jail on essentially sort of dubious charges. And I think if we take Salafa Salam's case, which is the one in the center there, you can look at the details. So Sarah, do you want to pick up on this?
No, I was just going to say that I'm also happy to focus on cases of people who I personally know, like Walid Abu Khair.
We go back one. Do you want to go back to Walid there? Let's go back.
Or if you scrolled up, I think, scroll up the other way. Khalid Dawood, I think. Yeah, Khalid Dawood, who's actually a friend of mine and nearly a colleague at Human Rights Watch.
That's the one at the top. So that's the one at the top. Yeah. So he's he's a well-known Egyptian journalist, and then he became part of the opposition and was opposed to. He was in the opposition anyway. But Sarah, you say a bit more about this.
Sure. I mean, Khalid Dawood is a very well-known liberal, secular journalist. He's had talk shows over the years. He has always been a leading progressive voice in the country, politically involved, obviously supported the revolution in Egypt, but was a staunch advocate of President Morsi during his short-lived administration, a strong opponent of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, he was severely beaten by some Muslim Brotherhood thugs during Morsi's administration and put in the hospital. And I think if you scroll down, you'll see images of him in the hospital where he suffered broken bones and attacks.
And that was under Morsi. The photographs there date from when Morsi was in control. It was in power. Is that right?
Yes, I believe so. But what happened after the coup is that he continued doing what he does, which is to be a critical journalist. And of course, he was also critical of the Sisi administration. And what the Sisi government did is actually, ironically, accuse him of being a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and has jailed him now for over a year in what the Egyptian government calls pre-trial detention, which is a fanciful term of locking someone up without presenting any evidence. Technically, these pre-trial detentions are supposed to be reviewed by a judge and renewed every, I think it's every 40 days, but in fact, they're automatically renewed. And when the 18-month period expires for the maximum amount of time that you can keep people in pretrial detention, what the government does is get rid of their original bogus charges and bring new bogus charges to restart the pretrial detention period.
Which brings us on to the next webpage, which is the prosecuting judge here. And this is Dear Khaled Al-Din. And if we go, and this is what I really like about what you're doing, is that normally these people are anonymous. You think about the bureaucracy and the judiciary in these authoritarian states, and the judges who make these decisions we know very little about. We know very little about the process, in fact. But in this case here, you really are exposing them. So you've got several profiles on key members of the Egyptian judiciary and other judiciaries as well.
Yes, and that again is very much the intent of spreading the shame. Most people know who General Sisi is, they know who Crown Prince MBS is, but if you ask them to go one level deeper, much less two levels deeper, as to who are the complicit bureaucrats in upholding the reign of terror of Sisi or the oppression of MBS, they don't know. They don't know, and the judges and the lawyers and the prosecutors and the prison wardens, they operate in the shadows. And on top of that, they carry with them a superficial prestige of being judges and lawyers and prosecutors, often invited to judicial conferences around the world, invited for trainings, and otherwise carrying a modicum of respectability by their title. What we hope to do is to shame them and expose them as the culprits they really are by detailing the crimes they've committed and tracking them whenever they are planning on traveling anywhere, to get them travel banned, to get them sanctioned, to get them excluded, to get them shunned.
As we can just scroll down to either below or up or down, because we see the photographs of some of the people. So these are other judges and other officials from different states as well. But do you try and pursue some of these cases are you bringing cases against them? I remember there were cases when Israeli officials or also senior military figures had cases brought against them. They really couldn't step off a plane in certain countries within Europe.
Yeah, we don't have plans to bring legal actions against them, but we hope that the information that we're gathering will provide the resources for others to bring legal actions based on the evidence and the information that we're gathering. And that's already happened based on my work at Human Rights Watch, for example, in our investigation and documentation of the Rabaa massacre, where the government killed over 1,000 protesters in broad daylight in 2014. Subsequently, one of the people who was brutally tortured, shot at, jailed at that protest, but who happened to be an American citizen and was jailed for over 2 years, came back to the United States and now has a lawsuit against one of the architects of that massacre, who happens to be in the United States. And the evidence that he's been using in his trial against this perpetrator, the acting prime minister at the time, Hazem Bablawi, who later went on to become a member of the board of the International Monetary Fund in Washington, was relying on the report in our investigation. Right, and
so his appointment was opposed?
Not there's a lawsuit against him. There's a lawsuit. That's right.
Okay. Well, this all comes back to trying to influence US policy as well. You've got the court cases raising public pressure, but essentially you want to try and influence US governmental policy, which brings us on to the change in the administration. I was looking at an article you wrote, and I don't see a lot of room for optimism.
Well, I mean, there's optimism in that certainly some of the things that President-elect Biden has said gives us room for optimism, particularly with respect to Saudi Arabia. President-elect Biden has unequivocally promised to end military sales to Saudi Arabia, to end our support for the war in Yemen, to reassess our relationship with that country. And of course, to hold MBS accountable for the murder of Jamal, and that's why we hope he's going to release the DNI report. But at the same time—
And Biden himself has said at some stage that Mohammed bin Sultan was responsible for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi.
Yes, that's right. And so we intend to hold him to those things and to those words. However, the reality is that President-elect Biden also takes a very conventional view of the Middle East as a whole, with conventional understandings of who are our allies and who are our enemies. And unfortunately, that package is now the notion that the Saudi, UAE, Israel, Egypt axis is the one that is on the side of the United States. Obviously, I don't believe that's actually true, nor do I believe it's in America's interest. But I think that Biden will certainly not independently or of his own volition look to dramatically change the US understanding of the Middle East and what our relationship should look like in the region. I'm very hopeful that we can push him to see, using the same analysis he subjected to Saudi Arabia, should be the same analysis he uses for the rest of the region. But whether he'll make that leap is a question that remains to be seen.
Weapons sales are an enormous part of that equation. The United States makes a very substantial amount of money selling weapons to the region to, after all, what are its allies. Is that something you're trying to stem? Is that something you campaign about?
Absolutely. And in fact, I would say it's probably our #1 foreign policy recommendation, which is that the United States, pursuant to its own laws, as well as its international human rights obligations, must halt arms sales and arms transfers to abusive governments, because providing military support and diplomatic cover to abusive governments means that the United States is complicit in the abuses, is supporting and enabling the abuses of these governments. And that's got to stop. So it's not so much about trying to pressure this or that government into doing this or that reform, but rather it's ending the harm that the United States is doing and the United Kingdom is doing by selling arms to abusive, unelected, unaccountable, belligerent governments.
Yeah. And are you specific in terms of the kind of weapons technology you're talking about? I mean, obviously the war in Yemen is something that's foremost in my mind.
No, we're not. And in fact, we would very much avoid that sort of specificity. You know, there is an American law called the Leahy Law, which curbs arms sales, or rather transfers of arms to units specifically implicated in abuses, provided you show that the US weapons have been used in the abuses. I don't believe there's any need to be so narrow or restrictive, because there are other US laws that clearly say we must not provide military support to abusive governments that are responsible for systematic and widespread abuses. Because I think what's important also to understand about these weapons transfers is that the significance is not just in the actual technology and hardware that's shipped, that's used. It is in the political support, in the legitimacy they bestow, that the United States bestows on these abusive governments by saying, we're on your side. The United States does not sell weapons to North Korea. The United States does not sell weapons to Iran. When it chooses the governments to sell arms to, it suggests that it has allied, friendly, close relationships. And that is what's a problem.
Right. Sarah, I want you to just give a bit of your own background. I mean, we've been focusing on Dawn's work and on the Middle East, but I want to know, I think people would be very enlightening for people here to understand how you got into this work, how you got into human rights work, how you actually had such an interest in the Middle East. And while Sarah's talking about that, I'd love people to start putting their questions in the Q&A box. We've got one from Nigel Harley already. We'll come to Nigel in just a second. But Sarah, how just tell me about, I mean, what did you graduate with? What was your background? How did you get into this work?
Sure. How many hours do you have? Just kidding. I'm a lawyer. I went to Harvard Law School, and my claim to fame is that I went to law school with President Obama. We were classmates. But my interest and focus on the Middle East and human rights work certainly predates law school. It was a huge area of interest for me during my undergraduate studies. At UC Berkeley, I spent a year abroad in Egypt and studied Middle Eastern studies as well as political science. So Middle Eastern politics has always been my personal passion and focus. But I'm also a product of the Middle East in many ways. My mother is Armenian from the Middle East. I've lived in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Egypt. I have a lot of family in the region, Armenian family, and the experiences of my family are very tied up in the experiences of most people in the Middle East. My grandparents were refugees in the Middle East. My mother was born in a refugee camp in Lebanon. My grandmother and uncle were killed in a war in the Middle East. There's nothing unique or special about that experience. What it is that I have a very personal understanding of the trauma of surviving as a Middle Eastern person, and a deep compassion for anyone who is subjected to oppression and displacement by forces they don't control.
Yeah. Nigel Harley, let's bring your question up. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yes, I mean, I'm listening to great work that Dawn are obviously doing, but I'm afraid I do have this concern that so often there have been initiatives started to try and bring particularly Saudi Arabia to heel. But the trouble is that, it's that huge arms, shall we say, the huge interest in arms. I mean, it is such a lucrative market. And sadly, I have to say, that the present Conservative government in the UK have got a history of dealing with Saudi and arms sales and that. And also, I think the French are pretty keen. So, whereas, I think it's absolutely commendable what the work that is being done, I do have this real sort of skepticism as to how successful it will be, given, as I say, such a lucrative market that the Saudis present. Thanks.
Sarah.
Do you want me to respond, Nick, or do you want to ask questions? Yeah. I guess I'll say, but as someone who's been doing human rights work as my living for almost 20 years now, I have no naivete whatsoever about the harsh and brutal realities of the world that we live in. And in fact, I have seen things get much worse in the Middle East, not better. So I have my eyes wide open about what the facts are, about the corruption of my government, your government, the extent to which they are now allowed themselves to be held hostage, not only by the arms industries, but also foreign government lobbyists. And this is, of course, much worse in the United States than it is in England, but just wait, it's going to get equally bad there. I mean, the political corruption in the United States is unprecedented. We now have nearly every country in the world hiring lobbyists to do their bidding. Recently, I saw something like Burkina Faso had hired lobbyists for some lobbying on some military aid. I mean, everybody wants to get in on the game, and it's so sad that these poor countries feel that they have to hire lobbyists and spend money on American politicians in order to get their issue heard. So I have no naivete about that, nor am I blind to the reality that power and might makes right, and might has made right throughout history. But I also know that we can have an impact. I know doing this work for many years that we have had an impact. And I know that the governments of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, the United States care deeply about their reputation. And that's because the governments that they're dealing with are democracies. And what the American public thinks matters a lot to them. And that's why they were panicked with Biden's election. That's why they have supported Trump's campaign as aggressively as they have. That's why they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on PR-fueled initiatives. They're not going the North Korea route, right? They care. And in fact, just yesterday in The Guardian, there was an article saying that they leaked to The Guardian, to Patrick Kingsley, that they are contemplating releasing the detained women activists because they realize the PR cost has been too high, which is, you know, a crappy reason to release them, but that's okay, we'll take it. So, you know, for me personally, and excuse me for getting a little bit metaphysical here, or philosophical for that matter, I believe very much in doing the right thing. I believe in fighting for what's right, because it's the only place I feel comfortable. It's the only place I feel happy. And I am, you know, pretty open-eyed about the fact that we're not going to win in the entirety, but I hope we're making things less bad. And I hope the history books will reflect that we didn't just take it like sheep, you know, that we have resisted oppression and tyranny and wrongness in all aspects. Some people are fighting in the environment. Some people are fighting racism. Everybody is, many of us, I wish it was everybody, are doing what they can. And that's all we can do, right? That's
Sarah, I mean, if you're talking about, you know, fighting injustice of all types, one thing I've noticed which is not on your website is anything to do with Palestine and the occupation of the West Bank. Shouldn't it be there too?
It should be there. We want it there. We have plans of all the things we want. It's purely a question of resources. You know, I can't even begin to tell you all of the things we should be doing and want to be doing, but aren't doing for lack of resources.
The reality is that's an issue in the US that it's difficult for you to get traction on. And if you were to launch and had that as an issue, you'd get a lot of flack.
Oh, that is the least of my concerns. You know, where I stand on the issue of Israel and Palestine is very well known. And if my board of directors had any concern whatsoever that they wanted someone who was going to be quiet on Israeli abuses, then they would never have hired me. We will continue to speak out broadly across the region on the role of foreign governments throughout the region, and that includes in Israel and Palestine. But we don't have dedicated research right now on Israel-Palestine. We don't have dedicated advocacy, purely for a question of resources. If we could raise the resources to have a researcher advocate on this issue, I think it's critically important. And I'll tell you why I think it's important. I think this is a narrative shifting moment for Israel and Palestine. The Palestinians could not be weaker. The Israelis could not be stronger. But we are at the crossing line. I think we've managed to push everyone over that crossing line, except for people who pretend, and that includes President-elect Biden, that the two-state solution is dead, that the holding pattern that they've forced on Palestinians for the last 30 years is a fraud. And in a weird way, there's also some gratitude to the Trump administration for clarifying that for us, for clarifying that for the international community. And so this is the moment when we have to force policymakers, Israelis, Palestinians, to grapple with what next. There's not going to be a two-state solution. You are an apartheid state. What next? How are those of us who believe in truth and justice and equality and fairness, who are on all sides of the political spectrum, now that two states is not an option, what's your plan? I think that's where the space is to be had, is to be made. I don't know if the international...
Just to follow on that, we had a very interesting session a few months ago with a former Jordanian foreign minister who said exactly the same thing, that the world needs to recognize the two-state solution is dead.
Is this Marwan Rashid?
Yeah. We need to start talking about Palestinian rights. So what are the? I know we've got lots of questions lining up here, but I've got to pick up on this one. So what are the first 2 or 3 things that you'd really want to pick up on there, following that thought?
Well, you know, one thing I would say is that I believe that our work, my work, Human Rights Watch's work, helped push Marwan to adopt that view. You know, Marwan has spent decades advocating and championing a 2-state solution. And for many, many years, including on the ground in Palestine and Israel, with progressive groups, with human rights groups, to suggest that the 2-state solution was dead was anathema. And the fact that this is what Marwan is now talking about is a reflection of why I do see that there's progress. I do see that there's a political space that has been opened that didn't exist before, and that we should be pushing very hard on the gas to go through. But I mean, I think that the principles for Israel-Palestine are the principles everywhere, for everybody, where you have multiple populations in a contested space. The principles are equality. The principles are justice. The principles are democracy. That is ultimately the only solution that's going to work for Israel-Palestine to provide peace and justice and equality, as it is everywhere else. Yeah. As it that there's nothing special or unique about the answers that we're proposing, that I'm proposing, that other rights advocates are proposing for Israel-Palestine. What's not an answer, what's not a solution, is to say we're not going to provide equality, we're not going to provide rights, we're not going to provide justice until some political solution off in the future. That's a lie.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that, Sarah. Simon, I'm going to come back to you for another question, if I may, because I think Nigel's question asked the same thing. Hilary Matthews, you've got a question about a specific case. Go ahead, Hilary.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, go on.
I watched Al Jazeera television quite a lot, and I wondered, first of all, what you think about its journalism and its how it deals with the Middle East. But they have along the ticker tape on the bottom of the screen every day that one of their journalists goes by the name of Mahmoud Hussein, has been in prison in Egypt for 1,418 days without trial. I wondered if you knew anything about that, and about how Al Jazeera deals with situations in the Middle East. And very quickly, secondly, I wonder if you worry about your own safety.
Yeah. Al Jazeera, I mean, I assume you watch Al Jazeera English, not Al Jazeera Arabic.
Yeah.
They're not identical. They do have sort of different editorial styles, different presentation styles. I think Al Jazeera, when we study the history books 100 years from now, is going to be recognized as one of the most transformative, revolutionary events or developments in the Middle East region. It basically, for the first time, connected all Arabic-speaking peoples around the world with more independent, critical journalism than had ever existed before. And I think that as a result, this is what helped create the space for the Arab uprisings of 2011. It's what ushered in the freedoms that people were then able to express through social media. But it really revolutionized the way that Arab journalists spoke about Arab governments. You know, did they do this consistently and even-handedly all the time? No. Al Jazeera was under a Saudi red line for a long, long time. You know, would never criticize Saudi Arabia, nor would it criticize the UAE, nor would it criticize Qatar, of course, where it's based. But its coverage of Iraq, its coverage of Egypt, its coverage of Morocco, its coverage of Tunisia, radically changed the understanding, expanded the understanding. It was like the printing press in many ways for the Middle East in bringing news and critical information to the region. So I think we are all forever indebted to the revolutionary mindset that brought Al Jazeera to the Arab peoples. Today, unfortunately, Al Jazeera is incredibly constrained because Qatar is on the outs now from Saudi Arabia, because governments have evicted Al Jazeera journalists from so many countries, if not actually killed them, as the United States did in Iraq, or Egypt has done by jailing Al Jazeera journalists like the one you mentioned. So like many human rights organizations, their on-the-ground coverage has become hugely circumscribed, and that is unfortunate. As unfortunate as it is for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and New York Times, all of us have shrinking access to the worst places in the world, by design, not by accident. The second piece of it, of course, is with the politicization of the region along sectarian lines, along Islamist versus non-Islamist lines, some of their coverage has become unprofessional, because they have such a plethora of talk shows, editorial content. Imagine, daily 5 hours of Sunday talk shows, not news. I think that's where they've run into the most problems, where they've had speakers, where they've had hosts and moderators expressing, views unsupported by facts, or views that are overly political and partisan in a way that's undermined some of their credibility as an independent critical broadcaster. I think Al Jazeera English is in a different league. It's fantastic. It's got incredibly professional journalists. It covers stories other people don't cover, and has really expanded the audience in the Western world to understand what's happening in the Middle East in a way that you don't see even from the BBC or the New York Times or CNN, certainly not from CNN.
Sarah, do you feel, you're in Washington, so you're safe there, but possibly not. Are you worried about your staff, or perhaps your staff safety as well?
Yeah, I suppose I'm certainly always worried about my staff because of the extent to which the Saudi government in particular has gone to target activists in exile and to target Saudis in exile. And I'm
give us some examples of that.
Sure. So, Jamal Khashoggi would be the first example of a Saudi the government is persecuted. Omar Abdulaziz is another person, another activist whom the Saudis targeted and had to live under security protection in Canada for a long time. They have attempted to kill a Saudi Arabian student in San Diego, but were thwarted by the FBI. They tried to capture and kill Khalid al-Jabri, who was a former government official and is in Canada right now, and his children are being held hostage in Saudi Arabia. I could go on and on by that. And Egypt, for its part, is going after the family members of activists abroad. So the people who have most at stake, the people who have most on the line, are people from the region, are the political exiles from the region who are vocal and active. And that is one of the main focuses of our organization, which we haven't talked about yet, which is being an institutional home for these political exiles, giving them a space to speak their voice, hopefully in a safe manner. I don't feel that here in the United States I'm at danger. I think the political liability for Saudi Arabia, to go after a US citizen, it would really be a different level of stupidity beyond the reckless impulsiveness of the murder of Jamal. And I think that MBS might have learned his lesson from that, certainly not to do anything worse. But people have different levels of risk tolerance and what they're comfortable doing. I'm terribly afraid of heights, but I had no problem going to Mosul when it was still occupied by ISIS. So it's a really personal thing. I can't go on roller coasters, but there are things I can do.
Right. Okay. Lois Tart, Lois in Australia.
Hi, I've got two completely unrelated questions. The first one goes to the sale of military hardware, etc. One of these collateral benefits, you might say, of selling military hardware is that organisations, US-based organisations, can field test this equipment. In other words, if you actually test it in a battlefield, you find out whether things work or not. And if the US wants to test their equipment, they can't run around shooting their own people, but they can get other governments to go and test it for them. And that's a huge benefit to your military, your whole military complex. The second one is that...
So are you advocating that, or are you just making the point?
I'm making the point, but I'm saying to what degree does this then drive the desire for military sales into regions which there are conflicts? Because it's sort of something, it's not just the money, it's actually, we get, basic feedback benefit from this. And it's one of those quiet drivers that military people will tell you about, whereas economists focus on the money side of things. The second one is the degree to which travel bans, etc. We've had a lot less travel. And one thing you find from people who do travel, and it's not just people, just, journalists, etc. It's all the little people who travel and say, oh, yes, this was happening here, that was happening there. Those travel bans have completely stopped. And it's a bit like say, well, we don't know what happens there because we can't talk to anybody who's been there recently. And that's something else that I really was interested to find out, is how much of these travel, the slowdown in travel to a certain degree bans has impacted on your work.
Yeah. I can't really speak to the first question. It's really outside my area of expertise. I'm not a military arms expert. I have no doubt that that is a collateral perk of arms sales. With respect to access, I mean, absolutely, the limitations on the ground access that governments have deliberately imposed on journalists, human rights investigators, academics, artists, even writers, is dramatic. And that is one of the things that has caused me the greatest concern and anguish. Anguish because for people in Gaza, for example, who are so isolated, are completely travel banned, living in the largest human cage on the planet, their only ability to interact with people, to have a sense of solidarity in the international community, was when internationals would come visit them there. And now Israel has shut even that down. It's nearly impossible for a foreigner to get into Gaza. And so it's very, very sad. But also concerned because this is a deliberate effort to have darkness so that we don't know what's going on, so that we can't see what's going on. When you couple that with things that governments do when they don't want information to get out, like shutting down the internet, shutting down Twitter, shutting down Facebook, I am very concerned about the power of governments, ironically, in 2020 to reduce people to living in villages that have very high walls around them.
Let's bring in Yuri Vint, also in Australia, and then we'll come to Simon Jackson. So Yuri, go ahead. Go on, Yuri.
Thank you, Nicholas. My question related to the strength of the civil societies in the various countries and the degree to which they can draw strength out of cross-country alliances. So my understanding is that the trade union movement, for example, was very significant in the revolution in Tunisia. And the question is whether or not there's cross-country trade union alliances and alliances between trade unions, organisations and, say, other civil societies. So is there a base for democratic aspirations through civil society in those countries?
And Sarah, perhaps you could say where you think civil society is at its strongest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that the trade union movement in Tunisia was one of the only existing bases of civil society that was able to have relations outside the country and build a level of solidarity. The new reality, the current reality, sadly, is that governments know that. And governments like the Egyptian government are terrified by their own civil societies and have done everything in their power to crush any notion of a civil society, any notion of any organization or gathering of private citizens in a way that's not controlled by the government has basically been outlawed in Egypt. The only ones just barely clinging on are the Journalists Association and the Lawyers Association, the Medical Association, but they themselves are routinely raided and arrested and so on. Saudi Arabia, there's no civil society. There's no organized civil society, period. It's always been banned. It's always been illegal. So whether or not the civil society on the ground is able to form these relationships or even to internally strengthen and develop and be prepared for a change in power in a way that the Egyptians were not, depends on the extent to which they have breathing room in the country on the ground. And that breathing room has only shrunk. So in Iran, for example, the government very deliberately goes after trade unionists, goes after the bus driver union, goes after the medical union, goes after the student union, because they know that anytime citizens gather together, they will become an independent source of power, an independent check on the government, and they don't want that. I'm sorry to give such a bleak answer, but that is the Goliath that we're fighting right now. The places where you see the strongest civil society is where the state is weak. That's why Lebanon has always had the most thriving civil society in the region, because the government, such as it is, an amalgam of power sharing, has always been too weak to control its own society, and the society has had to provide for itself, whether it's water or garbage collection or, parallel state functions, that it has become a strong, independent, critical civil society, unfortunately in many ways divided to its partisan faction. So you're either with the Hezbollah camp or with the Christian camp, the Maronite camp, the Armenian camp, the Greek camp, and so on. But that is where you see the strongest civil society. Civil society got stronger in Egypt when Mubarak got weaker. So governments recognize that. The weaker they are, the stronger civil society is. And with these governments, it's a zero-sum game. If their people are strong, they're weak, they're out. Because the minute civil society in these countries have a chance to express what they want, whether in protests in the street or in the ballot box, they send their government people out. These governments have no legitimacy. They are in power. They sustain themselves in power by brute military force, supported by the United States and supported by the UK in a number of cases.
And Australia.
And Australia.
Just to cover all our markets. We've only got a couple of New Zealanders there, and I think New Zealand's fine. Yuri, that was a really good question. Thank you very much for that. Simon Jackson, let's bring Simon in, or maybe Annie McMahon, I'm not too sure. Could be
no, you get the real thing tonight.
Great.
I too share all of your ideals and objectives, but could you talk to us a little about the practicalities of your advocacy? Preaching to the choir doesn't help. And
we being members of the choir, you mean?
Quite. And it would seem that the target audience, the people who can actually do something, most of them are doing pretty well out of the status quo, doing pretty well out of the status quo as it is. Status quo as it is, you know what I mean? So how do you get yourself listened to by the people who need to hear?
Sarah, do you want to talk about some of the support you've got in the Senate and Congress?
Sure. I mean, it changes by country. It changes by administration. I would say that during the Trump administration, nope, we weren't talking to too many people in the government. And I say that not only with my Dawn hat on, but with my Human Rights Watch hat on. This was a government that really had no interest in these issues. But that was completely different in the Obama administration. There were people we could reach. There were people we could persuade. There were people we could talk to do the right thing in certain limited instances that did matter and that do matter. I expect with the Biden administration, we will have those openings again. We will have a lot of those openings again. Will we have them on every issue? No, we won't. Will we have them on many issues? I hope so. So part of it is the direct political advocacy that we hope to do with the Biden administration, as well as administrations outside the United States. But part of it is also shaping the narrative, shaping the analysis. And that, I think, is a very critical part of what Dawn does. It's a more diffuse effort. It's not the kind of thing that you can measure with graphs and charts, but it is the kind of work that I believe I've successfully done over the past decade, particularly, for example, as we were speaking earlier, with respect to how the Israel-Palestine conflict is understood, what people believe is the solution, what the reference posts are, what the goalposts are. Similarly, we want to shift the narrative on how the United States perceives itself, on how policymakers, think tank writers, academics, lobbyists see and understand America's role in the region and what needs to change and what needs to happen. Because I do think some of these decisions are dictated by naked interests, but some of these decisions are also dictated by what people think is the right thing to do. I mean, there was a disease, I think it's lessened in this country, that the United States has to militarily intervene to fix or save or quote unquote do something with disastrous consequences for the people in the region. And I, for one, am very happy that President Obama did not send in the troops to Syria. Although I'm very disappointed that he provided unknown, unaccountable proxy forces with military aid, covert military aid for many, many years, contributing to pouring gasoline on what became the civil war in Syria. But there are people who legit believe that that's the answer, that the US should send in military troops, send in troops, send in troops. I don't think people believe that so much anymore. And I think that has to do with the narrative shifting, with the argumentation in the public sphere, among policymakers, debates, and so on, based on facts, that I think does shift the narrative. A country's understanding of itself, a people's understanding of itself and its role does matter. It does matter how policymakers, how the officials act and react to events on the ground.
Okay, Philip Godfrey, this is one last question. We've got a few minutes left here. Go ahead, Philip.
Thank you, Nicholas. Every time I come on this program, somebody's asked the question already, and Simon has done a good job of that. But so forgive me for if this is repetition, but I'd like to ask Sarah, if you were sitting with Joe Biden and Boris Johnson in a bar somewhere, and you were being asked to explain to them why the issue of Middle East dictatorships matters, the Saudi problem matters, and they were to say, well, we make lots of money. And I go back perhaps to your point that you made earlier that, you know, if it was Iran making lots of money, or the Americans selling a lot of weapons to Iran, we'd be making a bigger issue. We've sold massive amounts of weapons to the Iranians over the years. I'm sure you would agree. But if you were to sit there, how would you explain to them, beyond the economic consequences of disengaging with some of these countries and the moral consequences, why does it matter?
And I'm going to add to that. I'm going to add to that, Sarah. The United States doesn't want Saudi Arabia to implode either.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Sarah.
Let me start by giving you an example. When I was in Sana'a, in the capital of Yemen, at soon after the war started, the Houthis had taken over the capital, and there was graffiti all over the place. And if I had come prepared, I would have had an image of this graffiti. And the graffiti I saw most often all around Sana'a was "Death to America. American bombs kill Yemenis." One of the greatest responsibilities that our elected leaders have, that Biden has or Boris has, is to keep our citizens safe and to allow our citizens to be normal people in the world. The actions of the United States, the policies of the United Kingdom in the Middle East have exposed our citizens to great danger, to great hatred, to great desires for revenge. If you are a 17-year-old boy in Sana'a, whose university has just been cluster bombed with American cluster bombs, whose house has just been demolished by a British missile, who can't get food or medicine because of an arms embargo, rather a sea embargo, an air embargo, a land embargo that's blocking all points of entry by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which the UK and the US are supporting. What do you think you're going to grow up to be? Who are you going to try to hold responsible? These are not hypotheticals. This is the real world. Our government officials are putting us at danger by making us hated around the world. The right reason to do the right thing is because upholding human rights is a legal obligation, not just a moral one, but it's also a smart one. Why is nobody carrying out these kinds of global hatreds and attacks on countries, like, I don't know, think of a small country that's not doing these sorts of things in Latin America or I don't know, Vietnam or something. This is a matter of endangering our citizenry and endangering our ability of American businesses and British businesses to operate normally and freely without becoming targets themselves.
Thank you.
I think that they're, sorry.
I think you've answered my question.
Sarah, I would say, Malish, it doesn't matter. That's Yemen. It's too far away. And realistically, I mean, listen, you could make an argument about Syria because they can go through Turkey and get in a boat. But Yemen's just too far. We don't care.
Well, I mean, if you remember the so-called shoe bomber and other attackers that were emanating from Yemen, we live in a modern world. These geographic distances mean far less. And obviously, this isn't just about Yemen. This is about the entire region. This is about the entire Middle East region that remains subjugated and controlled, not entirely, but in large part, by governments that we are aiding and assisting. I mean, don't take my word for it. President Trump said the Saudi government wouldn't be around for 6 minutes if it wasn't for us supporting them.
So just to reinforce this point, if we go back to the Cold War, and basically the Middle East is a colonial setup and then reinforced by the Soviet Union on one side and the United States on the other. And then one person was left, and that's the United States. And your argument essentially is that these autocratic regimes they depend upon the US, and the US has enormous degree of influence in order to change these societies. And it's the US's fault that they haven't.
Nope, that's not what I'm saying. I do not believe in a foreign behemoth, a superpower, pushing its weight around, forcing other governments to do things or not do things, to pressure them, to use our so-called leverage, like this massive elephant going around bossing the world around. That is not the United States' role. It shouldn't be the United States' role. And it will fundamentally backfire and it won't work, as evidenced by the fact that nearly every instance of promised conditionality and leverage has never worked. What I'm saying is that the United States and the UK and every other government has its own human rights obligations that it must live up to. And that means not contributing to, not supporting, not aiding, not abetting the human rights abuses of others, not carrying out its own abuses. We are complicit. We as taxpayers, we are complicit in the crimes in Yemen. Forget about fixing the Middle East. Don't do bad things. It's so simple. Just you, America, democratic society, UK democratic society, Australia, you voters at least say, okay, we can't fix Saudi Arabia. We're not going to help them. We're not going to help them do bad things because that's what we're doing now. So I'm just saying, do no harm.
I've got one more question which has popped up, which we'll just get in. That's from Jim Lowenstein, who's also in Washington. Go ahead, Jim.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Are there any bright spots in the Middle East? I'm thinking of Jordan, for example.
There are bright spots. There are hundreds of millions of bright spots in the Middle East. And that is the people of the Middle East who have shown unbelievable resilience and patience and strength and endurance that are the reason that I have hope for the Middle East. Even in brutal Saudi Arabia, you still have young people saying, no, I'm not going to take this, like Lujain al-Hathoul, who was saying, I will go to jail. I will not be silent. Those are the bright spots of the Middle East. The people, the young people, the old people who are doing the heavy lifting of fighting for justice, fighting for their freedom, not waiting for anybody to come save them. There aren't enough of them, of course. People have been terrorized. People have been scared. But these are the heroes. These are the heroes of our world. Imagine a peaceful revolution in 2011 in Egypt, a country of 100 million people, nearly 100 million people. Protesters didn't kill anyone. Every Egyptian should have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize to have suffered under that 35 years of repression and dictatorship by Mubarak and toppled that guy peacefully. You know, here in New York, they're rioting, ready to kill each other. You know, when 1 or 2 or 100 African Americans are killed, blood's boiling. I understand, I sympathize. Imagine how patient the people of Egypt are. Imagine how civilized they are, that they undertook a peaceful revolution. They took bullets, they didn't give bullets for their freedom. Those are the bright spots of the Middle East.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. It's been a really interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your time. Sarah Leah Whitson, the Executive Director of Dawn, it's been wonderful.